Now that we've taken a look at the origins and nature of the Renaissance, why it happened, where it did, and when it did, and what humanism was, and humanist education, and some of the ideas the humanists had, we're going to spend the next couple of lectures looking at one of the centers of Renaissance culture, the city of Florence. And we'll take a look at the social, economic, and political structure of the city first of all, and then we'll take a look at the history of the city, its political history and military history, and then we'll also look at the histories of some of the other major Italian cities that were part of the Renaissance. But we do this because you have to ask yourself the question, exactly what kind of society was it which gave birth to the Renaissance? And we've already said in earlier lectures that it was essentially an urban society, and that was very important because it was very similar to antiquity, which was also urban. And we've also seen that, according to Hans Baron and others, that it was particularly Florence, which was the place where the Renaissance was born, or certainly one of the initial centers of Renaissance culture. So it's worth taking a look at the actual city of Florence and its internal structure, its politics and dynamics, and just to see, what kind of matrix gave rise to these ideas which have changed the course of Western history. So what we'll do first of all is start by taking a look at the population and the economic structure of Florence, which are very closely tied together, and then we'll look at the political structure a little bit later on and move on from there. Well, when you look at the economic structure of Florence, it's actually very simple. The woolen cloth industry was the most important industry and the most important economic activity in Florence. You could say that Florence was a one-industry town. And because of this, it was the woolen cloth industry which provided the money that was the backbone for the birth of the Renaissance. Now, we've already seen that Italy's trading links with the Middle East, especially through Venice and Genoa, Pisa, and other cities, also provided a great deal of the money that provided the economic means for the Renaissance, so you can't discount that by any means. But the huge role of the woolen cloth industry in Florence and the amount of money it produced really makes it worth taking a look at that. The woolen cloth industry in Florence, like in the rest of Europe, and I should point out at this point that the woolen cloth industry was the most important sector of the very small industrial sector of the European economy in the early modern period. The woolen cloth industry ran in cycles of expansion, contraction, boom and bust, if you want to look at it that way. And this is very typical of other places in Europe all through the early modern period, these cycles of boom and bust tend to follow population cycles. And typically what you'll see is when the population expands, the economy expands. When the population contracts, the economy contracts. And you might expect this to be a bad news for Florence during the Renaissance because we know population collapsed and there actually was a serious depression in the economy, which we're going to look at. But surprisingly, in some ways, you'll see that it was actually this depression which played a major role in giving birth to the Renaissance. And even economically speaking, and had it not been for the Depression, things might not have developed as they did in Florence. So it's really an interesting story. We'll start out a little bit before the Renaissance, about 1330 in Florence. 1330, the population of Florence was at its medieval peak of around 100,000. Now, to put that in perspective, compare it to the population of classical Athens, which was about 300,000. So what you see is that medieval Europe had not been very urban, and even at this period in the most urban area in Europe, cities are not terrifically big. But even at 100,000, Florence in 1330 is one of the biggest cities in Europe and can be compared favorably to such huge places as Paris and London at this time. Of the 100,000 people in Florence, about 30,000 worked in the woolen cloth industry. So that shows you how significant the industry was. The output of woolen cloth in 1330 was 1,200,000 florins per year. So a pretty substantial output of woolen cloth. So the wool industry, cloth industry, is the number one industry. The number two industry in the city is banking. And in many ways, Florence is the leading banking city in Europe during this time. There are 80 separate Florentine banking firms, of which the Bardi and Peruzzi are one. We'll talk about them in a couple of minutes. Of course, the famous Medici Bank, another. There are some 300 Florentine branch banks abroad. And this is very important because not only does it expand Florentine banking internationally, it has a real key role in the woolen cloth trade. Because what we'll see is that all these banks initially grew out of woolen cloth companies. They grew out of the woolen cloth industry. And they did so because their initial purpose was not to accept deposits and make loans. Their initial purpose was to help transfer funds and change currencies and help Florentine woolen cloth companies do business abroad, which they had to do really to make a profit. To do that, the Florentine banks had developed a kind of revolutionary financial instrument which is not adopted in the rest of Europe for some time, known as the Bill of Exchange. The Bill of Exchange is a way that banks developed not only to transfer funds out of the country to another country, but to actually change currencies from one currency to another. And this was made possible by the fact that Florentine banks had branches abroad. The way it essentially would work, if you were a Florentine merchant doing business in London, for example, and you had to pay off your people in London in pounds, which is pounds sterling is what they accept in London, and you're in Florence and you're doing business in Florence, you got a problem. So you go down to the local branch of the Bardi Bank, for example, which has a branch in London, and you say, I would like to buy a bill of exchange worth £100 sterling. And they would then sell you this bill of exchange worth £100 sterling for however many florins it would cost, let's say 300 florins. And you get this piece of paper with your name on it, which says, pay to the bearer upon presentation at the Bardi branch in London, £100 sterling. That's a terrific advantage because now you can take this one piece of paper, which is specific to you, it's got your signature on it, and you can travel to London. You don't have to carry cash, gold coins, or anything with you. The risk of being robbed is much, much lower. It's much easier to carry this one piece of paper. You get there, you do your business, you go down to the bank, you cash it in, you get your pounds, and you pay off the people you're doing business with, bring your product back. And you could do it in reverse. The English could do it through a branch of the Bardi to go to Florence. It really made business a lot easier, a lot safer, made the transfer of funds swifter, easier, and therefore made business just work a whole lot better. Bills of exchange weren't only used in Florence, but they were pioneered in Italy and, in fact, had not even made it to France by the 18th century. Well, 1348, the onset of the Black Death, is a very important point for the economic history of Florence because it damages Florence's economy in a very fundamental way. In 1348, first year of the plague, about 40,000 people in Florence died, which is approximately 1/2 the total population. So, this is a huge, huge demographic collapse. And of course, it disrupts wool production, wages shoot up, all the things we've seen in past lectures as being difficult. The population of Florence stays at a level of between 50 and 70,000 for the rest of the early modern period, which still ranks it as one of Europe's bigger cities. By 1350, into the first year and a half of the plague, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total population of Europe has been destroyed, which is a further blow to Florence's market. Florence has basically lost over 1/3, maybe as much as 1/2, of her total domestic and foreign market for woolen cloth, which is going to lead directly into an economic depression, which starts in Florence around 1350, as it starts in the rest of Europe around that same time, and will last for about 100 years. In most places in Europe, although it may not be as severe in Florence as in other places. In fact, though, the Florentine Depression in some ways had begun even before the onset of the Black Death. And this had to do with two huge Florentine banks known as the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, which both run into serious trouble in 1338, and in fact they collapse. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks were branches of the Bardi and Peruzzi woolen cloth businesses. They were pretty typical of Florentine banks in that they were very hierarchically structured, with most instructions coming down from the Florentine headquarters and not a lot of local flexibility, but It had worked out in the past. The Bardi and Peruzzi had been effective in providing banking functions for the woolen companies to buy raw wool in England. They then took this raw wool all the way back to Florence through a process we'll see later, manufactured it into woolen cloth, then sold it, and in many cases took it all the way back to London to sell. So we're talking about huge distances being covered here, large transfers of funds, a lot of money is involved, and in the 14th century, it's quite an achievement to think you're doing business on this kind of scale. And they were doing good business. They handled money transfers that were substantial. However, because they had money sitting around and they wanted to make it work for them, the Bardi and Peruzzi made the mistake of loaning money to the King of England, Edward III, who just happens to at that time have been involved in the 100 Years' War, which we talked about earlier on. As you know, the war was extremely expensive, was not particularly successful for anybody, and as a result of this, the king defaulted on his loans and both the banks collapsed. When the king says he's not going to pay off a loan, there's not much you can do to make him pay it off because he can just simply kick you out of the country. And so the banks just collapse, and this collapse of these two very large banks sent shockwaves throughout the entire Florentine wool and banking industry. So that was kind of the onset of bad times for the Florentine economy. Then, of course, comes the plague. Combined with the plague and the loss of markets there, you have a very serious economic depression in Florence. Interestingly, however, this economic depression actually helps create the Renaissance in Florence. And there might have been a very different situation had the depression not occurred. On the one hand, there was the general explanation we've already looked at, that when the economy was bad and things were disastrous, that your Italians, Florentines, and others chose a creative, positive, intellectual reaction, cultural reaction to the crisis, which became the Renaissance. And so in that sense, the Depression created the general conditions for a reaction, a kind of response, which became the essence of the Renaissance. But there's actually more to it than just that. There's a more specific economic explanation for why the Depression helped to cause the Renaissance. This explanation was offered by historian Robert Lopez from UCLA a number of years ago in a book he wrote, in which he argued that during the Depression in Florence, because commercial investment in business and commerce had become risky at best and even disastrous in many cases, that investors were tending to redirect their investment, and instead of investing in business and commerce, they began investing in art and culture, buying paintings, buying books, building libraries, commissioning sculpture, things like that. And the reason Lopez argues they did this was because art and culture are safe investments. They may not give you huge returns in times of economic expansion, but they're always going to increase gradually in price and cost and return over the years. And so you're not going to lose any money on it. And it's the kind of investment you can kind of count on, although it's not going to bring you huge returns. But in a time of depression, you're not likely to get huge returns in commercial industrial investments either. So it was attractive for that reason. Another thing that was attractive was that art offered people a kind of pleasure and a kind of comfort in these terrible, depressed times. And so they were buying things that they enjoyed having in their homes or reading or handling. And this comfort that they provided for the people who invested in them also is a significant factor to why funds tended to be invested in art and culture. Books, manuscripts, paintings. We'll see a lot of examples of this. Another factor here is that even though the plague is killing off a large portion of the Florentine population, the people who are left, who are not killed,